Welcome to Alpha Omega Tales, your home for boys love audiobooks and tales of love wrapped in old curses. The air smelled of rain warmed by embers and crushed pine, a scent that clung to the festival tents and to the hems of coats. Lantern smoke braided with honeyed incense and the wet sweetness of earth rose under the low clouds. In the crowd, the sound of boots and quiet laughter kept time like a heartbeat. Finn kept his hands deep in his pockets and his chin low, letting the fragrances settle around him like a borrowed cloak. He had learned to read the world by what it left on his skin. They called him the mark of a scandal, the half-born between packs. The word Omega was used as both shield and weapon. He lived between rows of medicinal herbs, tending thyme and balm to soothe others while the pack kept their distance. The festival was meant to be a ritual of unison, a chance for territories to lay claims and for elders to show the ledger of peace. Finn had always stood at the edge. He did not expect attention. He had not planned for the heir of the northern hold to pause, to let his gaze rest in a way that felt like a verdict. The first cut of humiliation was a joke muttered for everyone to hear. Laughter gathered like rain. Finn felt the prick of heat under his skin, a coil of shame, and something stranger tightening in his throat. The first voice to slice the stillness was thin and sharp. Marcus said, "I thought the herbs were for covering sins, not breeding them." A chorus of snickers rose. Rowan spat. "Keep your tongue, Marcus. He is an Omega, not a joke." Finn felt every pair of eyes as hands pressing him down. He tried to laugh, soft and hollow, as if to show he had no stake in their words. He had perfected the sound of indifference. Then the warmth came, sudden and wild, a bloom that did not belong to wine or anger. Finn's breath hitched and his fingers trembled. He could smell his own fear as if it were another spice. The crowd backed away, murmurs turning into a low hum of alarm. Someone hissed, "He is heating out of season." Someone else cried, "Control him." Hands reached but could not touch the center of what was happening. The heat became a tide. Finn's vision blurred at the edges, and his knees nearly failed. At the same time, a presence cut through the chaos like a cold blade. He felt strong arms under his shoulders, and then a figure holding him off his feet. Finn tasted metal and something like stone and distant rain. The man who cradled him smelled of river slate and crushed pine. His voice was low and rough. "Hold still," he said. "I will get you somewhere safe." Finn had no name for the relief that rose up along with his dread. The crowd's laughter shrank into anxious whispers as the stranger carried him away from the firelight and the judging eyes. The lodge where the stranger took him smelled of cedar and drying herbs. The floor was warm, the oil lamp low, and the air was laced with the bitter sweetness of a tea Finn had not learned to recognize. The man set him on a cot and pushed damp cloths to Finn's forehead. His hands were steady and rough at the same time. "You are shivering," the man observed. "I am Kieran." He did not wait for thanks. He only looked, as if scanning a map, as if trying to find where Finn's danger began and where it might end. Finn noticed the faintest bruise or discoloration at the base of his neck that had not been there before, a curious mark like ink on pale skin. He did not know when it had appeared. Kieran hummed a sound that could have been displeasure or thought, and then said, "This is not normal." Voices filtered through the lodge door. Eldra the elder whispered, "We cannot ignore this. Tomas, see if the medics have salves. Lila, gather what you need. Jonah, tell Marcus to hold his tongue." Outside the lodge porch, the pack murmured in clusters. Marcus paced with clenched jaw, while Rowan stood between him and the rest, arms crossed and worry creasing his brow. Within the room, Kieran kept a measured distance, and yet Finn felt held in a web of care and command that he had not asked for. Protagonist backstory. Finn had been born on the border between two territories, a child of love and quiet rebellion. As a child, he learned to identify herbs by the way they sighed when crushed, to soothe fevers by listening to how the eyelids fluttered. He learned that his mother had been an outsider, and that the word "child of two lines" meant a life of polite distance. He remembers nights of being watched from porches and mornings when neighbors passed without meeting his eyes. Those early memories shaped his modesty and his habit of disappearing into work. In adolescence, Finn cultivated solitude into a shield. He apprenticed to Leela, the pack's healer, where he found a place where his hands were useful and his silence respected. He learned rites and recipes, how to press calendula so it still looked like sun, how to stitch wounds so the scars would read as stories rather than shame. His skill made him indispensable and invisible at the same time. People sent for him, then turned away when the work was done. Loss threaded through his life as an ache. His father left when Finn was small, a quiet absence that no explanation healed. The rumor of why lingered like a bitter root, stitched to Finn's identity. He carried that legacy under his skin like a stubborn seed. In his present, he cultivated small acts of care, tending the sick, mending claws and lives. The mark he found at the festival felt like an old bruise given a new voice, an accusation and an invitation both. Antagonist Alpha backstory, Kieran had been raised at the center of command, schooled in maps and treaties, taught to read the curves of power like a landscape. He was an heir trained to hold a pack together through storms. His public face was granite steady. Privately, he carried the weight of promises made by his ancestors and the fear of repeating old mistakes. He had seen bonds torn by shame once before and vowed not to let history loop again. As a leader, Kieran prized order and protection, but those instincts had been tempered by a private loneliness. He had given little room for tenderness, but he understood pain in a precise way, the way someone reads a temperature and knows whether to wrap a limb or leave it be. His life had been about anticipating disasters and sealing them before they became losses. Meeting Finn had shifted something, like a misfiled note that nevertheless made the rest of the sheet rearrange itself. He did not intend to be soft, he intended to be enough. The morning after the festival, Finn woke in a cot and the mark at his neck still looked fresh, as if a tiny hand had pressed ink into his skin. Kieran hovered at the bedside, an expression Finn could not name. The lodge smelled of pine resins and brewing roots. Leela bustled in with a tray and an old satchel of vials. Her voice was brisk and kind. "Sit up," she said. "You drank something?" Finn shook his head. "Did anyone touch you?" Kieran asked. Finn swallowed and whispered, "I was carried." Kieran's jaw tightened. "Who touched you?" he demanded. Finn could not tell if Kieran's voice was accusation or a question of claim. They spoke in short, true phrases and in long, weighted silences. Kieran said, "You cannot stay in the square until we know what this is." Finn said, "I am not a child." Leela laughed softly. "You are stubborn and you are injured is different," she said. Jonah poked his head in. "Marcus demands an answer," he said. Rowan followed him, quiet and careful. "We will test blood and herbs," Kieran said. "We will keep you here." Finn's heart beat in a slow, tired rhythm. He felt both trapped and safe. The lodge rules were simple. No visitors without permission, no leaving after dusk. Kieran added a single command. "You will tell me everything you remember about the night." Finn found himself answering in pieces, as if his memories were glass he had to pass without cutting someone. Rumors are teeth that chew rumor into febrile myths. By the time Finn had been medicated and wrapped in a blanket, the square had assembled a roster of murmurers. Eldra told Tomas to disperse gossip, but Tomas had his own list of names to consult. The pack discussed claims and inheritance and what a mark on an Omega meant. Some whispered that a claim would bind Finn to whoever marked him, altering both fate and status. Lila clucked her tongue. "This is not how claims bleed into the world," she said. Rowan stayed with Finn like a harbor. He brought news and small comforts, a cup warmed between his palms, and stories that had no sting. Throughout the lodge there were layers of sounds and scents. Tea of willow bark brewed, the metallic clink of glass vials, the soft scrape of a pencil as Eldra recorded observations. Finn noticed little things that tethered him. The roughness of Kieran's hands as he steadied a lamp. The soft exhale a long breath that smelled like rain. The way Marcus paced outside, the cadence of his anger like stones rolling down a hill. He catalogued feelings as if making a tincture, testing what mixed and what curdled. The first real confession came one night, late and low, when the rest of the lodge had dimmed. Kieran pressed both palms against the mark at Finn's neck with a gentleness that contradicted his command. When he spoke, his voice was uneven. "I have seen this before," he said. "It is bound to an old curse." Finn's laugh was a small thing. "A curse," he repeated. That sounded like a story to settle children. Kieran looked at him as if measuring truth. "It is not a story," he said. "Our ancestors used binding marks to keep peace by force. Sometimes the mark chooses to bind not a slave, but a protector." Their first intimacy was cautious, like reaching for a scar to see if it still hurt. Kieran admitted fear of what the mark might mean for both of them. "I cannot promise I will always be right," he said. Finn answered with a question instead of a confession. "Why me?" he asked. Kieran touched his lips to Finn's hair and said, "Because you move me in ways I did not expect." The touch grew into a kiss that tasted of willow and rain. The kiss was apology and claim and the smallest revolution at once. The political maneuvers arrived like formal letters. Marcus, ambitious and sharp, sent an emissary. His man was Tomas, a man who knew gossip and leverage. Tomas spoke with the practiced tone of someone who could turn a wound into advantage. He said, "Marcus offers a controlled alliance. He will take measures to ensure stability." Finn listened to words that smelled of iron and counting. Rowan bristled. "You would trade a person for prestige?" he snapped. Marcus would not reply to insult. Kieran intervened with a voice like a held blade. "We will not bargain with lives," he said. Tomas left with a promise to return with proposals and threats. The lodge prepared for pressure from without. In the quieter hours, Finn and Kieran argued in hushed and raw exchanges. "How can you lock me away and claim?" "Protection?" Finn asked. "How am I to trust a hand that can command my stay?" Kieran answered with a confession about duty and fear. "I claimed you to keep the pack from ripping you apart," he said. "You were both a risk and an accusation, and I could not let them leverage you." The dialogue stretched, containing at least 8 small shifts between accusation, defense, apologies, and tenderness. They traded barbs and confessions in a pattern that left Finn dizzy and oddly grateful. As rumors grew, so did symptoms unexplained. Finn developed nights of fever where the lodge filled with the smell of crushed mint and menthol as Leela worked, and with it came vivid micro-flashbacks to a childhood moment when his father packed bags and left with no goodbye. He saw the edges of that memory like frayed cloth. These flashes were a punishment and a clue. There was a hint that the mark did not only bind physically. It threaded emotions, memory, and the pressure of lineage. Leela muttered about ancient tinctures and old papers. Eldra brought a thin leather ledger with faded script. The text spoke of a binding that transferred loyalty and pain together. The discovery pushed the lodge into a spiraling investigation. Moment of tension 1. Finn awoke sweating and sharp with memory. In a sudden flash, he was 6 again, watching his father leave, the smell of oil and old tobacco in the doorway. Then the present slammed back like a hand. He heard shouting in the square and footsteps pound the lodge steps. A group had come to take him away by claim. Finn felt panic as a physical wave. Kieran barreled into the hall and planted himself between them. He said, "You will not touch him." Marcus snarled, "There will be order." Kieran moved like a controlled storm, and the men hesitated. Finn watched every jaw set and every breathing measured. He made a decision in that brutal instant to trust the man who roared against his past. He stepped behind Kieran and felt the press of protection like a shield. The researchers of old rites in the lodge found a fragment of scripture that described a malediction placed by ancestors who feared dissension. The passage was clinical and terrible. It stated the mark could anchor grief and amplify longing, folding it into duty. The words felt like frost along Finn's spine.
Leela sighed. The mark was designed to weaponize attachment. Eldra rubbed her temples. This explains the heat and the sudden memories. Kieran closed his eyes, as if feeling his ancestors weigh him. He said, "Then we unbind what we can and keep what we must." The words sounded like a plan and like a prayer. Moment of tension 2. The attempt at a ritual was messy and human. Under lamplight, the lodge lined herbs, knives, and small bowls of milk. Rowan hummed an old stave as Kieran channeled energy toward the mark. Finn felt the air thicken, tasted iron and
clay. Memories rose, not only of his father, but of a mother who whispered forbidden lullabies. Finn reached for Kieran and found his hand, and the contact sparked something that was both healing and ripping. The mark pulsed like a trapped animal, resisting and then shifting. For a breath, they all held the thin line between success and catastrophe. Then a sudden wall of sound as a traitor from within the pack struck the outer door, a shove of betrayal that sent a spray of shards from the ritual bowl. Leela cursed and grabbed Finn, pulling him clear. The ritual sputtered. The mark dimmed but had not freed them. The lodge smelled of burned sage and cold metal. The traitor was revealed to be a close ally of Marcus, an agent who wanted control. His name was Jonah, though that morning he was a messenger of deceit. He had been coaxed by promises that played on fear. In the confrontation, Kieran's temper finally broke barriers built by duty. He advanced with a force that was both animal and judicial. The clash was messy. Finn found himself pressed to the floor, hands clasped over his neck as men shoved and rearranged loyalties across bodies. A bite of pain, and then silence like snow. When it cleared, Rowan aided Finn to his feet, and Kieran stood with a wound that traced his brow. They had won that skirmish, but the cost left a bruise on trust. The truth of the malediction unfolded like old parchment. Eldra translated more lines that spoke of a doctrine enacted during a famine when ancestors bound outsiders to prevent defection. The mark was not only possession, but a mirror. It could reflect the deepest fear of the pack back onto the marked. If the pack feared betrayal, the mark would amplify memory into betrayal. If the pack yearned for protection, the mark could twist longing into servitude. The mechanism was part ritual, part biology, a weaving of blood and belief. It fed on communal fear and consolidated power by making love a liability. Moment of tension 3. Final confrontation came at the territorial boundary, under a sky fretted with low clouds. Marcus had gathered men and formalized an ultimatum. "We will claim the mark and set the terms," he announced. Kieran replied with a choice. "We will not let you trade a life for politics." The challenge escalated into open conflict. Finn had to step forward and speak so that what bound him could not be used as a bargaining chip. He said, "I choose neither fear nor to be pawned. If this mark means anything, it will mean whatever I decide with those I trust." His voice trembled with remembered loneliness and newly minted courage. The men argued, swords skirred and tempers flared. In the scuffle, Finn felt heat and remembered every abandonment. He locked eyes with Marcus and realized that the rivalry had always been more about legacy than him. Kieran moved with a ferocity that was both protective and merciless. In the end, Marcus withdrew with honor intact and grievances to nurse. The crisis passed but left them altered. The healing that followed was measured and imperfect. Lila concocted salves from honey and willow, from crushed mint and the bitter root that steadied breath. The mark softened to a pale circle but did not vanish. Eldra proposed a ritual that would not remove the mark entirely but would reframe its claim. It would change the tether from ownership to bond, from enforced loyalty to chosen protection. The lodge prepared for the ceremony with careful offerings. Names were called and positions assigned. The pack sent delegates who watched and judged. Among them were Thomas, Marcus, Rowan, Lila, Eldra, and a few betas who had once been silent. Everyone present bore weight and opinion. The bonding ritual was a mosaic of scent and speech. Kieran spoke first, voice steady and open. Finn replied with a vow that was both private and public. The words were simple. I will not be used, and I will not be broken. I choose who I bind to. Kieran promised in return to honor that choosing. When they sealed it, the energy that moved between them was not one of compulsion, but of reciprocity. The mark warmed and then cooled, like a hearth becoming a lamp. The community felt something shift. Some faces softened, some frowned, but the ledger of recognition began to rewrite itself. Epilogue, 1 month later. 1 month later, the lodge smelled less of desperation and more of drying herbs. Finn tended a new bed of calendula and rosemary that he had planted under a window where rain could reach it. Children from the pack came to see the man they had once mocked and now brought small offerings, dandelions and hand-stitched cloths. Marcus watched from the periphery with a measured face that had less of contempt and more of calculus. Rowan sat at the garden edge and told Finn stories about old rebellions that ended badly and some that ended with laughter. Kieran toured the territory, checking borders, and returning each evening to a warm meal and the slight curl of Finn waiting by the lamp. The mark on Finn's neck was faint and occasionally flashed warmth when Kieran rested a hand there. The smell of pine and honey was now threaded with the fragrance of home. 3 months later. At 3 months, the pack held a small ceremony to acknowledge Finn in a new capacity. Eldra announced that he would be the steward of the medicinal border, a role that required travel and trust. The ceremony was modest, with a wreath of thyme and a cup of brewed galanga passed among elders. Tomas offered a terse apology for earlier threats and handed Finn a small ledger where he had recorded names and deeds that might have been overlooked. The ledger felt like a tangible sign that histories could be amended. Finn found himself laughing with Rowan over a clumsy joke about a goat and then later resting his head against Kieran's chest beneath a low sky. The mark was present like a scar that had become a map. 6 months later, after 6 months, the pack's map had shifted. Children learned to ask questions they had once been hushed for. Newcomers were introduced more gently, and stories about lineage were told with broader kindness. Marcus and Kieran had established a pragmatic detente that involved trade and mutual patrols. Finn had become an informal teacher to younger Omegas and to those who doubted what a house could be. Leela opened an herb shop on the outskirts and included Finn's remedies on the shelves, stamped with his small, neat signature. The mark remained on Finn's neck as a copper coin remains on a ledger, a record of a transaction and a token of a bargain changed by choice. The air in the lodge now often smelled of baked bread, of lavender hung to dry, of wood smoke that was not meant to hide anything. The final thought Finn carried was simple and private. He touched the mark sometimes, just to remind himself that belonging could be earned and given and chosen. He learned that wounds could become maps if you let them be read with care. Kieran often stood in the doorway and watched Finn with an expression that mixed relief and claim. Once, quietly, Kieran said, "The mark taught us to see what we feared." Finn smiled and answered, "Then we decide who we fear and who we love." The moment settled like a hand on the shoulder. If this story spoke to you, tell us in the comments whether you would accept protection that began as confinement. Start your answer with one word. Choose either protected or betrayed. Share the small reasons, the moments you think matter. Your thoughts help others who listen and shape the stories we will tell next. We read and learn from every voice. Now, return your attention to the lodge as the night thickens and the final candle burns low. The scent of the lodge was no longer accusation, but home. The mark had been transformed into a sign that named a choice rather than a claim. The pack slowly rewrote its ledger, and Finn learned that the place where shame once lived could become the foundation of belonging. He inhaled, feeling the air fill with pine and basil, and for the first time he felt that a name could be gentle.
If this story touched you, come back for the next chapter and hear how promises are kept and sometimes requited.